This is You Can UX 2, Avoiding the Programmer's Interface. Hi, I'm Eryn. I make websites. And he kind of gave it away, but I'm not a UX professional. I have no formal qualifications to give you this talk. So if you're actually a UX professional, you might just want to leave, because I'm going to use all the words wrong, you're going to be disappointed. Sorry, messing up with my stuff here. I'm not an interaction designer, I'm an experience architect, I'm not a content strategist, and I am definitely not a designer. My coworker offered to help me with the slides, and in retrospect, I should have taken him up on it, but I at least found a font that wasn't Arial. No, I'm a software engineer at Clockwork. It's an agency in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And being an interactive agency, we do a lot of projects. So everything from brochure sites that are really beautiful, but not necessarily like technically challenging, to content-heavy sites that have really high user demand. So like we do the site for the YMCA, for example. So there's not a lot of technical challenges there, but there's a lot of stuff to sort through and a lot of people who want to get information out of that site. And then we do everything to e-commerce. So that is a marriage of both technical problems and user problems, because if no one can use your site, no one's going to buy your stuff, no one's going to pay you to write phase 2. So we do stuff that is just across the board. And I think that we make websites that are really beautiful. I think they're technically on top of their game. We use best practices from semantic HTML straight through to server security. But that's not what makes websites good, and it's not what makes our websites good. What makes our sites good, our secret to our success, is that we focus on user experience first and foremost. So every step of the process, gathering requirements, talking to the clients, writing the dev plan, doing the test cases, they're all based on the user's experience and what someone should see at the end of the process. So if I'm not a developer or not a UX person, why am I qualified to give this talk? Well, I'm giving this talk for the same reason I think you should be here, and that's that programmers need to care very deeply about the interfaces that they write. Real fast, how many people here write mostly front-end stuff, front-end code, HTML, CSS? Okay. How many people do mostly back-end? So PHP on the server, that's a pretty equal split. I'm kind of surprised, that's awesome. But that's the split, right? So when we talk about it, it's like, well, I live in the browser, or I live on the server. And if what you do is on the server, what's happening on the browser just feels like a million miles away. You're like, I got classes, I got APIs, I just rewrote this thing to use MongoDB. I don't even care. Don't even care what's happening in the browser. But that's the thing, is that if you don't have something in the browser, no one can see that you just rewrote that thing to use MongoDB, and they'll never appreciate how smart you are for doing that. So it can be like, you want to just be like, keep your fluffy stuff, you keep your HTML, you worry about the modals. I have queries to write. But that is not going to suffice if you actually want to write software that is good. And if it doesn't have a good interface, people are still going to use it, but they won't be happy. They're going to use it until something better comes along, and then you're out of a job. So you need to be thinking about all the way through keeping your website something that users want to use. And I also think that programmers are uniquely positioned to have an opinion on user interfaces because we write them. And that sounds silly, but think about it. If you're a composer, you write music, but you also play an instrument. And at first glance, it's like, well, duh. But composers don't have to play an instrument. That instrument is how they get their idea out. That instrument is what's between what's in their brain and you understanding the marks on the paper need to sound like this. So it's a tool. The piano is the ultimate prototyping engine. And they use it to get their ideas out. And the same thing for your interfaces. Whatever you're doing on the back end, that's cool. That can be your focus. But if you aren't making an interface that tells people what your ideas are, then you're totally losing the opportunity to share your ideas. And furthermore, I think you can do it. I think the divide between UX people and developers is totally arbitrary. And yes, UX people have a ton of training and a ton of focus, and they will be always better at it than I will be. I can totally grant that. But the idea that it's black and white, the idea that there's front end, back end, the idea that there's UX nerd, that's outdated, that's old. We need to move away from that. Because just like, think about it this way. We probably use more software than anybody in the world. Like I use 20 different software packages from Apache to ACK to PHP just to write software all day. And then I go home and use 20 more software packages to watch Hulu and to browse the internet and to track my fitness and to do any of that stuff. And once you use something enough, you start to get qualified to have opinions on it. You didn't go to school for it, you might not have read Don't Make Me Think yet, but you know what works and what doesn't. Like you know when something's kind of sucks to use and when it's not so bad. It's just like if you watch reality TV long enough, you're gonna get an opinion on who should win Dancing with the Stars. It's the same thing. So don't feel like you don't have a right to be in this talk or to be having an opinion about this. As a user of software, you can help design the interfaces, even as a dev. So I'm going to talk about practical, actionable things that you can do to make your UX experience better for yourself and your users. I'm going to talk about how to work with the UX person in your life if you're lucky enough to have one. And I'm going to talk about why you should care. But first, let's answer the obvious question from the title of the talk. What is the programmer's interface? It's that. And it's that. And Linus, forgive me, but a lot of times it's that. And you'll notice I'm running Linux, but it's still that. And it's that. And it's every time an interface looks a whole lot more like a database than it looks like a piece of software. It's when you can look at that software and understand exactly what the columns are that that person is trying to fill out. Pardon me. And that's where it comes from. I like to think of it as giving a visual to scope creep, because what happened, it didn't start this way. Oh, sorry. It didn't start this way. I have faith in whoever wrote this, that they never meant that to happen. They started with a reasonable set of features. And then someone came in and said, but it needs to do that. And you're like, oh, okay. Well, that's fine. I can add that to the remove section. And then another manager came in and said, but it needs to also, we have clients that do it this way. And you're like, oh, well, okay, I can accommodate that edge case. And then you show it to a developer buddy, and they're like, oh my God, if you expose this one parameter, I can use this for this other thing, and it'll be great. And you're like, well, I can expose that. And eventually you end up with this. And it's checkboxes that disable radio buttons on the other side of the screen, and it's like you can't even figure out I don't even know what this software does except for the title and the window bar. So no one meant to do this, it just sort of happened as a result of a bad process around forming the UI. So I just need to hammer this home. You aren't inherently bad at UX. You are just a victim of a process that isn't adequately respecting what your brain has to do to make good UX. But why care? We have UX people, right? And like, that's their job. They'll tell me what to write, I'll implement it, it's no big deal. But that's a cop-out. All software has users. Whether you're writing something for the command line, which is pretty much going to be only touched by other Uber nerds, or you're writing something for internal clients, or you're writing something for bona fide end users, every piece of software you write has a user. APIs have users. Twilio, if you don't know them, they're an SMS sort of phone, telephony company. They're doing great stuff, and they actually have a developer experience team to design their APIs. So every single thing that anybody touches has a user. And you need to respect that, because most of the time you're the user and you know when it sucks. Sorry. Additionally, in that API example, you can tell the difference between a well thought out language and one that just happened. And God bless PHP, I'm here and I love it and I write it every day, but it's much more a language that just happened. And what that means is that it's not really intuitive. You know, like there are parts of it that are great, and there's other parts that until you do it every single day and you kind of just memorize, like, oh, this function, oh, that function, you're looking it up all the time. And if you ever take a month off, you ever go to Europe and you backpack around the world and come back, you're gonna look it up all again. And that's not a good use of time. And users have the same thing going on the interfaces that are written for them without careful consideration. The best software happens when everyone on the team feels ownership of the user interface. So we a lot of times think of software as just the technical bits. Like I say, I write software. And what I mean by that is I write code and I put it in files with a .php extension and it gets information in and out of a database, and at some point it sends some template variables to the browser. That's what I mean when I say I write software. But that's only one part of it. Software is holistic. It's the whole package. It is everything from the database to the UI, and it's the corner stuff, like the error messages and the documentation. Without any part of that, you don't actually have a piece of software. So given that, the best software is going to result when everybody on the team is concerned about writing the best software that the user can get their hands on. And the reason for that is that the UX person, they're going to come up with some beautiful wireframes. And they're going to be wonderful, and they're going to be great, and they're going to touch every case that they understand. But what they don't know is where the error messages are, or what part's going to be extra slow, or what sounds like a good idea but is actually going to break in IE7, and that's one of our target audiences, and we just can't go there even as much as I want to. That's the stuff that you can bring to the table. And the secret is, this is what UX people are talking about at their conferences. They're talking about, we have to polish our error messages. They're talking about, we need to understand interstitial states better and figure out where these landing pages are and how we can move people past them. But they don't know where they are, and we do. So we have a responsibility to the software, to these UX people, to help them understand the things that they're missing, that they desperately want to polish, and we are the only people with the power to make them understand where they are. So I strongly believe that if you aren't thinking about the UX, no matter what your team position is on the team, and especially if you're a dev, you're just not doing the best job that you can do. And that's why we're here, right? Like, you wouldn't be at a conference on your Saturday if you weren't interested in writing better software. And there's going to be other sessions about technical stuff. There's going to be other sessions about really interesting new technologies and things. But at the end of the day, the software is written for a person, and if you don't own their experience, then it won't happen. So how can we do better? The programmer's interface happens when you try to design an interface at the same time that you're writing it. These are two separate thought processes. And if you try to do one before the other, or I'm sorry, if you don't do one before the other, you're going to shortchange one of them. And since we're devs, we're going to shortchange the UX. The programmer's interface comes from thinking more about the back-end application than the actual user interface. It comes from thinking about your database and your columns, figuring out what pieces of information I'm going to need to do this and that, and then designing an interface to get it, as opposed to starting from use cases and saying, what is the user trying to do with my software? How can I support that? It also happens when we forget that everybody in the world is not a programmer, and that's easy to do when you spend all day with programmers. But users don't know about tables. They don't know about column constraints. They don't know set theory. They don't know Boolean logic, as much as I've been trying to push that one for a really long time. They don't understand forms. You'd think they do, but the user doesn't get why they can't double click on that submit, why that's not going to send something through twice. And we're like, well, duh. And they're like, you deleted me twice. So we have to remember that we are programming for a different audience than ourselves. but most often, and I can admit to this, the programmer's interface happens when we realize how hard it would be to implement the best idea, and we rationalize settling for the second best idea, or the third or the fourth, or just whatever's easiest. I'm not even going to quantify it. When you do this, sometimes it's conscious. Sometimes you think, I have budget constraints, I got a deadline, the sprint is ending in 2 days, I can't justify writing that sweet date picker. I just can't do it. And you know what, they don't even need it anyway. It'll be fine. They can type in the date, we're used to typing in dates, whatever. And sometimes it just starts small. Like you're like, it's okay if this exports into 3 columns instead of 1 because they can join it in Excel, it'll be fine. And I'd have to refactor the export to change it because they come out of the, no, it'll be fine, it's worth it, it's a good trade-off. You know, like I'm gonna save time in the long run. But, and that might be true, there might be cases where that's true, totally. Like software is constantly making trade-offs between this feature, that feature, do the hours go here, do they go there, and it's never done. But you have to be careful when you start thinking that way because it starts small and then it just goes to crazy town. And then you get that thing we saw on the screen earlier. Because before you know it, your standards are slipping and you get to that point, you're like, oh dear God, but it's too late. You can't refactor it at that point. Like you legitimately don't have the time in the schedule then. So it's really important to like take a step back, catch yourself early, and not let the slippery slope happen. So here's my first buzzword, UX first. I mentioned before, you need to plan in 2 distinct parts. They are just totally different parts of the brain. I say that with no neurological background, but they're totally different parts of the brain. They think in different ways. They have different motives and incentives. And if possible, you want to have 2 people doing this. One person who can think about the UX and advocate for the users, and one person who can think about the code and advocate for the dev. It's not always realistic. But if you're not in that position, what you need to do yourself is just decide to do UX first. Sit down, think about the use cases, write out some wireframes, get it to a point where you're like, yeah, man, if I was a user, that'd be cool. Don't even think about how to write it, because that's when you're going to start making decisions based on arbitrary constraints, like the design pattern you want to use or the tables on the database or whatever. Just think about the user's experience first. Then, once you've got that and you're comfortable with it, and I personally like to physically stand up from my desk, go into another room that has a whiteboard, and do it there, because removing myself from Code Town helps a lot. And if you know Balsamiq, if you know OmniGraffle, if you want to do formal wireframes, that's totally fine. And if you don't, that's more than okay. I do the vast majority of my stuff either on a piece of paper with a pen, novel concept, to a programmer, or on a whiteboard, and I take a picture of it with my smartphone, and then file it on my computer. That's all you really need, because these aren't client deliverables. You're not showing this to anybody who's not on your team. It's just for you in 2 weeks when you want to remember what decision you made and not mess it up. And maybe show your coworker and see if they're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. The benefit of this is that it's a great way to figure out what to build. So if you sit down and start thinking about your data first, you can very easily start tracking columns you don't need and getting ahead of yourself and saying, oh, well, if we do it this way, then we can support if they want to one day. And that just snowballs. That's like the mother of bad software. But if you start with UX first, if you start by designing the use cases and what your users want to get out of it, then you're going to end up with a list of requirements that draws directly from the features. And then you're going to end up with a development plan, or whatever you want to call it, that draws directly from those requirements. And you're not going to write anything you don't need. And then the best part is you can even write a test plan that draws directly from the use cases and the requirements. So there's all these checks along the way to make sure you're only building what you need to build and you're not getting out of hand. My second point for you is UX first and third and fifth and seventh and all of the odd numbers, because you're gonna have to go back. You're not gonna write it once and then go off into your coder cave and then just do it. Not if you're trying to not shortchange this process. You're gonna do UX first and you're gonna sit down and you're gonna start writing. And you're gonna hit some point in the code where you legitimately can't do that thing you thought you could do. There's some validation requirement. There's a reason that the UPS API won't interact with the addresses you want. You know, you're gonna come up with some totally legitimate reason to need to change your UX. But what you should not do is try to fix it on the fly and keep going. You need to go back to UX. So take off the coder hat, leave your coder cave, go back into that room with the whiteboard, and try again. And very deliberately separate those thought processes. As many times as you have to iterate over them. You need to be separating them so that you don't shortchange either one. Because once you don't, you fall back into that pattern we were talking about before where it's easier to do this. My second buzzword for you, and it's my last one, I promise, is user-centered design. It's, I really like the Wikipedia definition for it, so I just used it. It's a process in which the needs, wants, and limitations of end users of a product are given extensive attention at each stage of the design process. So you don't let everyone go off into a cave. You don't let everyone say, all right, well, I'll do the UX thing, and you decide how it should look, and you can go figure out the tables. Everybody's working together, and the whole time, everything comes back to the user. So if somebody wants to write a new feature, you say, okay, how does that line up against our requirements? If somebody wants to refactor XYZ, how does that line up against our requirements? Somebody wants to use the coolest new carousel that they saw on a list apart, how does that go back to our requirements? So you're always coming back to making sure that what you're writing is something that needs to be written and will serve the needs of the software that you're trying to create. User-centered design is actually like, there's a formal ISO definition of it, and this is a really great visualization. So it starts with analyzing. Sit down, talk about the requirements, talk about the use cases. Next, you design based on those requirements, and then you implement. So this is our UX first, broken out a little bit farther. So you've got analyze and design. Don't write a single wireframe till you know what they need. Don't write a single bit of code till you've got your wireframes. But then what happens next is you validate. So the next thing you do is you implement it, you wait a little while, and then you look at your analytics, or you user test it, or you show it to your coworker and just see what they think about it. You know, you do any variety of things to see if you did the right thing, and then it's a circle. You do it again. Now that we've found how that worked, let's analyze, let's design, let's go through the whole process, and you just keep iterating over it as opposed to thinking that you're ever going to get this right the first time, because spoiler alert, you're not. So takeaway number 3, there is no one true universal UX. I feel like developers fall in this trap a lot because we really like absolutes. We really like to know what the answer is. There's not an answer, especially when it comes to UX. You're going to iterate, and you're going to try a thing, and you'll get some results, and you try another thing, and you get other results. You just got to make value decisions. This is from a blog post by Luke W., whose last name I always butcher, called Developing Design Principles. He is a really well-respected UX person. He has written a lot of books. One in particular I would recommend is, I forget the name of it, but it's about forms. It's Luke W.'s book about forms. And it's awesome because if there's anything that developers touch more than anything else, it's got to be forms. So that's a great read. But this is about developing design principles, and what he is comparing is Facebook has come up with a list of design principles, and the HTC One has. And in their own list, they look fine. You're like, oh yeah, totally, that makes sense. But they're super different from each other. Facebook is universal. HTC One, super personalized. That's their goal. Facebook is consistent and transparent. HTC One is keep it close, keep it right by only what they want, let it be changing, let it be exactly what that user wants to see. Facebook wants to be consistent. HTC wants you to discover the unexpected, tiny delights, things happen and you're just so happy that your phone made that decision for you and you couldn't be more overjoyed. They're both completely legitimate UX directions. They're just different. So if you really want to get into how are we going to do this UX, first thing you need to decide is what are our goals? What are we designing toward? Because just like you want to be comparing those requirements back to what the user needs, you also want to be comparing what you think the user needs with your goals. So you're always dialing back upstream, keeping yourself in check. Don't reinvent the wheel, developers. I think that there's this idea that you want to make the newest and the coolest, and you want to come up with this great new solution for something, or on the flip side, you just kind of forget that someone else has already solved this problem. So just like you would go to Stack Overflow and you're like, someone has to have tried to integrate X with Y before. Like I don't need to solve this. When you're trying to do an interface, think about places you've seen it before and steal it. Because if it's happened once, that's a great idea. And if you do it twice, it's a design pattern. So you wanna use things that have already happened, and not just because it's easier on you, though clearly it will be. It's because the user's used to it. Users don't want to be surprised. They don't want to see new stuff all the time. They just want their software to get out of the way, let them do their task, and then go. So if you can use a paradigm that they're already used to, something that they've seen before, then it's just gonna make their lives so much easier, and in turn make your lives easier. This is one thing that as devs we're really good at, and fortunately it helps with UI too. So pattern matching, seeing the consistencies in a bunch of sets of data. Whether you are trying to figure out how to lay out the options on a page, maybe you've got 10 different actions a user can take. You don't want to just put that in one big list. You could. Sort of ugly. So you're like, well, where do these go on the page? Think about what makes them similar, what makes them different. Think about how they relate to each other. And what you want to do is try to figure out how to make that useful. So there's a lot of ways, especially when you're a really good pattern matcher, when your brain just goes to that you can be like, these are alike, and normal people are like, no, they're not. They're not at all alike. And you're like, well, they all start with L. And it's like, well, okay, that doesn't help. So, real fast, let's say we had these words that we had to sort for our site. This is our content strategy right here. Lemurs and llamas and lollipops. So the first thing you might think is color. I mean, that's what the eye's drawn to, it's only human. So you're like, well, we'll put the red ones and the green ones and the yellow ones. And I'm not gonna say that you're wrong, because technically that's right, but it's not useful. So maybe the next thing you think is, okay, a lot of L's, a lot of O's, that's pretty easy, we could do that. Still not useful. What you want to do is figure out what do these things have in common and what does the user care about them. And this is a fairly trivial example, but it applies to all sorts of actions, data pieces, content, whatever it is that you're trying to do for the UX. Think about what it has in common. Think about what's different about it, because that's sometimes even more important, and separate them. And you'll notice that octopus is in the bottom half. And that's kind of a trick question, right? That's kind of an ambiguous one, because it's an animal and it's a food. But because we made the decision to put it in the second half, we're telling the user what to think about it. We're saying that in this context, octopus is a food. I understand how you might have been confused before, but no, believe me, today it's a food. And they say, okay, I get that. I can figure that out from the stuff around it. So you can apply that too to your UIs. You can say, maybe this label would be a bit ambiguous. Maybe edit wouldn't make a lot of sense, but when I put it next to these other things, it's very clear what it's doing. So think about finding the patterns in the data that you're seeing and figuring out how to implement them. The other big one is you need to protect your users. Don't trust them. They'll do stupid things. They'll do terrible things to themselves and their data. And you need to never write that interface where you're like, well, if you use it the right way, then it's like, nope. They will find the wrong way, I promise. And this doesn't come up a ton with user-facing, like true end user-facing software, usually because at some point your manager is like, fix that. But it comes up a lot in command line utilities. So you're writing a script and you're like, well, I know that if I ever don't spell this right, it'll be okay. Like, I just won't do it. But you will in 3 months when you forgot that and go back. You're gonna do that and you're gonna erase the entire database. So protect your users. Use the simple YN prompt. Write a little utility, reuse it, it'll be great. But don't ever assume that you can tell people how not to screw a thing up. If the interface allows them to do it, they'll do it. End of story. Along those lines, don't expect people to read a thing. They won't. No one's gonna do anything on a website if you have to make them work, if you make them work for it. People are lazy, they don't have time for that, and they're not gonna do it. They're just gonna ignore the text. So the challenge then is to write something that doesn't need documentation to use. And you can the rule of thumb for this is how complex is it? Is this a user with a really specialized task? Is this somebody who works in accounting and they do this crazy specific thing and they understand that this software is really powerful and they need to learn it? Well, then you can get away with a little more reading. If it's just like a registration form on a website, your challenge, if you want them to register, is to figure out how to get them to understand what they have to do intuitively. How do they walk through this form and know what information to give you without ever having to read a single thing besides the labels on the fields? And how do they know what not to give you? How are they going to not submit that and get a validation error? Because studies have shown that every time that happens, you lose people. Every time somebody submits a form and gets a validation error, there's a huge percentage drop off. No matter how much they thought they wanted to do that thing, they're just like, I'm out. I'm done. So you need to figure out how to get things right the first time, because users don't give you second chances. And you know this because you're a user. And how many times have you gone to a site and you're like, oh, screw this, I'm done. They do the same thing, and they're probably less forgiving. Like, we know how hard it is to write software. We understand that when you get a MySQL error back from a page, that person's maybe a little less professional than they should be, but you understand how that happened. You can give them some leeway. Non-devs don't do that. So any leeway that you feel like you're comfortable giving a website that's a little bad, just in your head, slash it by 50%. Because the people you're writing software for don't have patience for that. Also, avoid surprising behavior. This is probably the UX tenet I go back to most when I'm designing things. Because what gets really tempting as a developer, when you understand how the system works and you understand that if A then B, but if C then D and E, it's super tempting to say, well, if they chose C, then I'll jump them straight to E. Like, I know I'm going to help them. I'm going to save them a little time. We'll just take them straight to that last option. The thing is, you lost to the user when you did that. They don't know how they got there. And so, as a developer, it's important to remember that sometimes it's worth giving them an extra click just to make sure they know how they ended up where they ended up. This is the hard one for developers, I think. Watch people use your software, because the first thing they're going to do is exactly not what you thought they were going to do. They're going to go down a totally different path. They're going to find a bug you didn't even know could exist, and they're going to delete the whole database. So it's really important to watch other people use your software. That can just be like your coworker. Like, this does not have to be a big usability thing. It's okay. But keep in mind that UX people do user tests because we're wrong all the time about how we think people will use software. At PHP Tech, Harper Reed, who was the CTO of Obama for America, so he's got a little experience making big websites, he said that they used to do A/B testing all the time. So that's where you put up 2 versions of a website and you do have some analytics and you see how one performs versus the other. And they would always take bets before they did it. They would say, all right, clearly B is going to win, but let's do the test anyway. And the overwhelming majority of the time, they were wrong. They were always wrong about what they thought users wanted. So they'd vote on B and A would win, it would like 96%, like it was crazy. So there's no shame in showing someone your software and having them use it a way you didn't expect. And it's hard because sometimes we get defensive. Like someone uses a software and they say, there's a bug, and your first reaction is, no, it's a feature. I wrote it that way on purpose, you're doing it wrong. But if you actually want to write good stuff, you need to believe people when they tell you that it's not working. You need to believe when they say, I tried this and it didn't work. And even if you knew it would work that way, you did that on purpose, it feels like a bug to them. It feels unexpected, it feels like something they don't want. And it's super important not to get defensive at that moment and tell your QA that they got that totally wrong. It's just to be like, you know what? I hear you. But clearly I did something wrong. I'll go back and think about it. So, how can we work better with the UX people if we're lucky to have them? Your job is to think about how the implementation is going to affect the UX. So there are technical realities to the internet, right? Like HTML can only do certain things, and there's certain round trip issues, and there's AJAX, and there's security, and there's cross-site scripting, and there's these things that just like not physically, that doesn't make sense, literally are not possible. So your job is to help the UX people find those edge cases, understand when what they're asking for is too much, and specifically that last one. So if the UX person says, I want to do it this way, and you're like, oh dear Lord, that is going to be 2 weeks of work. Like, I suppose that does sound lovely, but you're out of your mind. Say that. Say it nicer. But say that, because you'll probably be able to make it easier for both of you. Last week, true story, I was working on a website with the UX person, and she comes up to me and she's like, okay, I have this crazy idea. I want to take, and I was like, oh dear God. She goes, I want to take a map of the US, and when you click on a state, we'll pull up locations that are in that state. And all the locations are listed, like city and state as a column, and I'm like, oh honey, we can do that. She's like, whoa, okay. So then she flips the page, and she goes, and this one, this isn't a big deal because I know we have the location, so when you type in your zip code, it's going to pull up anything within 100 miles. And I'm like, whoa, 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 whoa. That one's really hard. And she's like, wait, it is? I'm like, yeah, and I kind of explained geolocate, and she was like, boo. But at the end of that conversation, she was like, well, that's like not a big deal. Like, we can just search on city and state. That's fine. I didn't know that was going to be like a 4-week feature. So instead of me sweating it and being like, I don't know how I am possibly going to get this done, by just communicating openly with her, we were able to find a solution where she was like, that's not even that important to me. And certainly sometimes you say that and they're like, I don't care. Fine, 2 weeks. But a lot of times you say, that's too freaking hard. And they go, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know. How should we change it? So you're going to make life easier for both of you if you can do that. So that's a concept I like to think of as yes, but. Never say no. Never say no. Say, yes, we can do that, but it's a 4-week feature. Or yes, we can do that, but I think it's going to make this other page really weird because you're not thinking about how the data is going to interact there. So have open communication with your UX people because they don't want to make your lives hard. It just seems that way because they don't know how not to. But they don't want it, so just talk to them. You'll figure it out. Also, really important, know your limits. All this talk about you guys being UX designers is great and you should do it, but there will be a point at which you can't. And that's okay. You don't have training in this. You've maybe read 2 books. I've read like 4. Like, it's okay, you're gonna hit a point where you don't know. Defer. Ask the UX person what they think. And they'll probably just be flattered. They like feeling loved and needed. And there's nothing wrong with just saying, you know what, I don't know how to do this best. What do you think? They'll go away for an hour, they'll come back and give you something, and you're like, wow, I know how you earn your salary now. It's always okay to say, I don't know. As an aside, if you don't have user people, you should hire some. But you can also use a site called usertesting.com. It's relatively inexpensive, especially if you're making software you're selling. And real human beings will do tests on your software and return their feedback. Steve Krug, who wrote the book Don't Make Me Think, which if you've never read a UX book in your life, you should absolutely read. He did a study where they did a bunch of user tests, and they found that the vast majority of issues that people find in usability tests come up in the first 3 tests. So you don't have to do an extensive usability survey. You don't have to get 20 people in to click and see what happens. You can just do even one, 2, or 3 tests on usertest.com. You need to be discriminating about false positives, of course, because what one person finds to be an issue won't necessarily be. But you're going to hear about the vast majority of your issues in those first 3 tests. So that can be money really well spent. Thanks. So is there oh man. Okay, so we're doing book giveaways at all of the talks. This one is about user-centered design. It's an O'Reilly book. So it's that graphic that I had with the circle, that's the concept that's in here. So I'm not sure how best to give this away. I'm kind of put on the spot. But I think that we'll do questions. And then if you have like a really, really good one or a really good story about designing things, then you can get the book. So are there any questions? Yeah. Ooh, I can't hear you, but she's going to come to you with the microphone.
About was how much time should we limit that we spend on the user interface? Knowing that we're like programmers, is there like a limit, like we're spending 1-2 hours, we kind of say, okay, this is way too much?
That is a really good question, because it's definitely one of those things that you can fall down the rabbit hole. I would say it's always going to depend on the interface, right? Like the level of complexity there. But I would say give it an hour, see how you feel, and at that point you're going to get a sense of like, I can handle this, I can figure out what I'm doing here, or I'm in over my head, I never should have attempted this, I'm going to go find my UX buddy and see what they think. So I would sort of check in with yourself, but if you're not tasked with being the primary UX person, which has happened before for me, I wouldn't spend too much time because you're just going to be spinning your wheels. Any other questions?
Suppose you have a site or application which has to go on multiple form factors,
Mm-hmm.
and the UX person is not really experienced with this. How do you deal with those kind of situations?
So like it has to be on desktop and mobile. That's definitely like a little bit above my personal skill level, but I would recommend, I would probably recommend like a mobile first approach, and I know you're saying that it already exists, but I think what you kind of want to think about there is what's the most important chunks of content, what do we have to display first and foremost, and then let everything else kind of fade from that. And there's actually Luke W. that I referenced, he has a really good book about that. So if you really want to dive in, that would be a great place to go.
That was a good talk, thank
Thanks.
you.
You get the book. Kidding.
I did that work. If you work, this is a hypothetical situation. If you work for a company where management has no concept and doesn't care about UX, how do you go about introducing that to them, saying, this is really great? You know, what do you do?
Yeah, I worked there. Part of the answer is I don't work there anymore. But that, you know, that's a little idealistic. What I did was first I convinced them to I would just send blog posts. Just be like, well, you know, find 15 minutes, read this UX thing, and just made it very innocent just to kind of get that seed planted. And then for us, it was very easy to look at our analytics and our metrics and be like, look, we clearly have a problem with how people are accessing our software. We're getting comments from users, we're getting a lot of, you know, bounces. So with that data, it was a lot easier to say, I know we don't feel like we know how to approach this, but it's clear that we have to. And that helped. It still took years before a UX person was actually hired, but that really helped get that conversation going, was having that data. Yeah?
You just mentioned analytics. Have you looked at instrumenting your code to measure how users are using your software or sites?
The vast majority of the analytics that we do are front end. So there's obviously a lot of opportunity for like putting it in your PHP, and we do that, but it's a little bit more for performance metrics. So like, is this too slow or not? But something like Google Analytics and event tracking, and that's a whole world of figuring out how to use that tool, but you can read a few blog posts and get a sense of it and really start seeing patterns about how people are bouncing and using a few well-placed events and seeing if it's people are getting to it or not. And that's a pretty lightweight thing to do. You just have to drop the JavaScript on the page and do a little more tinkering, and then you got it. How are we on time? I think we're at. Okay. All right. I'm so sorry we're at time, but I will be here. So come if you have questions, ask me. And shoot the book. This is hard. Okay. I think that you complimented me and also want to get your company started on UX, and that's awesome. So if you want the book, it's yours. Yep. Thank you, everybody.
Great talk.
Thank you.